Welcome to the community channel, Ted. As you know, the mission of our project is to connect peer-to-peer mentoring for millennial and Gen Z social scientists. Although we're all very behind to become a peer of yours, given your experience around the globe, we think you'd had a lot to offer for young professionals. So to kick off, let's begin with your career journey from the beginning. Where did you start when you were 24, and what are three most important things that brought you here?
Yes, well listen, thank you. It's very nice to be invited to talk today. In terms of my career journey, it's been very varied. I started off as a linguist. I studied Spanish and Portuguese at university. And while I was there, I became fascinated in the Cuban Revolution and also in Africa via Portuguese Africa. And that's why I did my PhD at university in political science, looking at the Cuban intervention in Angola. But after finishing my PhD, I started working freelance as a writer on the economics and politics of Africa, and gradually I managed to build a career as an analyst, first working for the Economist Intelligence Unit, which is a branch of the Economist Group, and then as head of research at a Pan-African bank, EcoBank. So I've built up over those years many different kinds of expertise, particularly African markets, particularly Fintech, particularly commodities, but I have many other interests as well. In terms of the three most important things I've learned, the first and most important of all is the importance of a positive attitude and a passion to go for it. There are so many rejections you'll get in life. People will always tell you it's incredibly difficult, but it's always been that way. There's always been a lot of competition out there. There's always been unfairness. But if you really go for it and you have a positive attitude, you will succeed. You just need to keep going. The second most important thing I'd say is learning from mistakes. I've definitely made some mistakes in life. Things like blowing good opportunities, ruining good relationships, failing to deliver something, it might be a presentation or a project, when you knew you could have done better. But if you learn from those mistakes and you really think about why you made them, it may not just be that you didn't have the time, it may be you didn't have the courage to stand up to someone, it may be there's some issue you have in your personality that you've really got to deal with. But if you really learn from those mistakes and you, if you like, leverage them and flip them, they can be the basis of the most successful things you do in your career. Everyone who's successful talks with a big chuckle about these disasters because of what they did after the disaster. So learn from your mistakes. And I think the third thing is be comfortable in your own skin. Nowadays, you don't have to fit into a particular box. You are a finance person, you are development, or you just like political science. They can cross over. And things like Fintech, which are digital, there aren't any really clear barriers between them. If you can put together a different series of expertises in different fields and different interests, you can create a niche, and there's a good opportunity you can really build a career from it. You don't have to have very fixed horizons. Open them up, and particularly with digital, see where it will take you.
So you've worked all around the globe. Many students and recent grads aspire to do just that, but they're having a lot of issue with visa and also with local networks and languages. So what advice would you give them?
Well, I think, look, it's very different for me because I'm white English, I'm British, so it's relatively easy for me to travel almost anywhere in the world. And even if in Africa I need to get an invitation to visit certain countries, that's relatively straightforward. It's very different if you're from what's considered a developing market trying to get visas. But I think the key thing is, for most students who do these MBA courses, they are able to get visas. They do have, if you like, the funding. They're able to get the necessary paperwork. My advice would be, if there's a particular country that you want to work in and there's a particular organization you want to work with, then get yourself to that country. One of the standard ways that people get their first job is they just turn up. If, let's say, you wanted to work in Vietnam, you flew out there, you found the organization, introduced yourselves, you could say, I'm available, and quite possibly there will be work for you. And it may be it's unpaid initially, it may be it's not exactly what you want, but you get yourself on the radar. So that's really one of the most important things when it comes to traveling. I did that for my year off from school when I was 18. I wanted to get into movies in Mexico, and so I went to Mexico. And I did eventually get into movies. It was quite a difficult process. But the basic point is it just comes down to throwing yourself out there. The other thing also is to try and build your network of contacts. And there's many ways to do that. It can start with just meeting one individual person at a round table or a conference, but there are many other ways of building your contacts. And that's probably the most important thing, because that's where the opportunities will arise. Ultimately, I've always tried to do a job which I find interesting, and then I've tried to find ways for people to pay me more and more for it. And there are some organizations that will never pay you well, and there are some jobs that will never pay well. But nearly every job out there does have a higher end version, which is nearly always to do with experience and someone having developed a very good network where people want to hear their opinions and ideas. So that would be the main thing I'd say, is really go out there and develop that. Develop your network as your own. And over the years, that's when it pays off. Don't feel frustrated if at the age of 24, 25, you've only really got 3 or 4 people who are good in your network. That's fine, because you build it year after year. That's where your strength comes from.
So just to hone in on that point, what skills are essential skills to develop if you wanted to build a career?
Yeah, well, I think the important thing about skills is actually it's not about any specific skill set. I think the first thing is to have an ability to learn. One of the issues I have as an Anglo-Saxon is I find the Francophone world very rational and rather too hierarchical and structured. The idea has to be beautiful rather than looking for solutions, trying to be a little bit innovative and different. So the thing is, if you have a mindset, which it means that you are able to learn, that you're open to new ideas, that's probably the most important thing that they're going to be looking for in the future economy. They don't want someone to come in and say, I know all of these technical details up to now, because 3 years from now, all of those details will be out of date. They want to know that if you say, we're going to plunge you into this new thing or this new kind of technology, you're up for it. You have the mind which can take on new ideas and be innovative. So that's one of the most important things, is to really be open and try and develop that. I think the other thing is building relationships with people. That so much of the power and strength you get from your business relationships is because you've built a personal connection with these people. And that takes a long time. So you could be brilliant at a particular job and you could have the best CV. But if you go into the interview or even the informal coffee with someone and you make a bad impression and you can't connect with the person, you will never get anywhere. It definitely comes down to personal relationships. Digital means are a great way of enhancing them, but there's nothing compared to the sitting down and having a cup of coffee with someone and making a connection. And that connection could be about anything. It's just not just about the job. So I would say for anyone who has a bit of a difficulty talking with other people or networking, work on that, because that's the most important thing. There's many times I've given jobs to people because they literally were the best personality and I thought, you're a good fit for the team, I like you. And yeah, you know what, you don't have those skills? Well, you look smart enough to learn them. We'll train you up in 3 weeks. So I'd say those are the key things I'd say in terms of skills.
Thank you. That's amazing advice. So Ted, there is a question that's on a lot of students' mind. That is, how do you break into the development industry when you have 0 to 2 years of experience when most jobs require 3 to 5 years experience, even at the entry level?
Exactly. I think this is the classic chicken and egg situation. You will not be given a job unless you have experience. You cannot get experience unless you have a job. So how do you do it? Everyone does it. The fact is you find a way in. So internships obviously is one of the ways people go. It can be said that that doesn't count for experience, but the reality is if you want to get a senior role when you have just finished a master's in your mid-20s, it's unlikely. But you could get a role 2 steps down, and you could get a role which is on the escalator to get there. It might be the assistant, it might be the deputy, or tied to a team. So I think the main thing is if you identify a company or a particular team that you really like, start to make that connection. You might be able to start doing some work there and work your way in, and that will give you the opportunity to get into the role. The reality is when you're going up for a job, certain very senior jobs absolutely have to have a minimum of professional experience, but there are many other jobs when they say minimum 2 to 3 years where actually they're looking for maturity and the right kind of fit in the person. And it could be you could actually get around that one and say, look, I did a year of this, etc., but your ideas and your personality and your engagement, they'll give you the opportunity. You just got to find your way in. And bear in mind, everyone else is up against the same thing. So do whatever it takes to get that experience and get into the teams so that when the opportunity arises, you can take it.
So just a follow-up for the internship. A lot of the internship with the large organization like UN are unpaid. So that is a significant barrier for a lot of people who have financial constraint.
Yes.
So in addition to internship, what other ways would you suggest?
Usually the real benefit of an internship is that you end up doing stuff way above your pay grade because they just end up throwing at you and you get that experience, and from that you're supposed to get a job. But in many cases it's just become a way of getting young, intelligent people to work for free. So try every other way to get in, I guess. The key thing is to find the organizations or the teams that you want to be part of and build that relationship with them. Ultimately, there are all kinds of different jobs that you can do. Anyone can write a blog or do vlogs on particular issues or pieces and start to build a thought leadership capacity in themselves. But ultimately, I think the thing is getting out there, seeing as if you can get to as many of these events and get-togethers and gatherings where you're likely to be able to meet these different people and see if you can make a connection. That's where it comes from.
Now, a lot of people are saying that time is different. So what would you say is the major difference between when you started your career compared to now?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is this balance between the digital and the analog world. I think particularly about how business is done, because so much business is done digitally. There's many clients I've worked for where entirely our contact has been either via video connection or WhatsApp or emails and documentation. We never actually met. But I think it's about getting the balance between the two. So certainly when I started, at the age of 24, the World Wide Web was only a couple of years old. I don't think anyone had an email address. Completely different now, and everyone, even people in Africa, have got their own smartphones with addresses all over. So that's really changed on that front. And therefore, I think it's hard to get the balance right on that one, because there are still left over a lot of things that people did to get a job back in the 90s or whatever, which are completely obsolete now. For example, sending out 20 CVs. That was the standard thing you'd do. You'd print out a bunch of resumes and you'd send them to people. That's a complete waste of time nowadays. How you get on people's radar is the most difficult thing, and ultimately it comes from about building the network. For me, I think the key thing I believe is I don't believe it's any more difficult for a young professional coming into the world to get a job than it was before. Before, it was bloody hard. Now, it's bloody hard. It's the same. When I left school, we were entering the worst recession in a decade. Then there was another recession. Then there was the global financial crisis. There's always a crisis. There's always traditional jobs being eaten away, and there's always vested interests, old grey hairs who are in there who we want to get out so we can get the jobs. That hasn't changed. So my view on this one definitely is don't fool yourself that this is unusually unfair. It's tough. But at the same time, there are so many more opportunities in terms of what you can do than beforehand. And so you have a lot more freedom in terms of building the kind of career that you want to.
Since we're talking about innovation and new works, we can talk about startup scene in Africa. So what's going on there? What innovative impact are being created there? And are there any opportunities for young students out there?
Yes, and so the answer is yes to all of those questions. Africa's innovative landscape is one of the areas that interests me the most. There's probably over 850 startup hubs in Africa at the moment, and each hub that would have 10 fintechs in it. So there is an enormous innovative landscape which is growing in Africa. You take countries like Kenya, they've had people using digital payments on their phones for more than 12 years. You have an entire generation now who is fully digitalized and increasingly integrated into the digital economy. So in terms of the innovation going on there, it's kind of mind-blowing. I would describe it a bit like the Wakanda moment. That moment in Black Panther when you suddenly pass through the force field and you realize that in Africa, they're using technology better than your own. And I have many examples of that I've seen in Africa at the moment. Particularly, the technology is able to resolve some of these problems that have always persisted and have never had a resolution. For example, how do you make most Africans bankable? If they don't have any credit history or identity or any collateral, you can't lend to them. But you can with digital. As soon as you have that digital footprint, you have an ability to give them small amounts of financing delivered digitally, so almost at no cost, and you can add insurance onto that and other products. And there are many other things as well. I mean, even just take someone's identity. It could be that you could use their mobile phone as their ID. If you know someone is always going to be in their house, the mobile phone is always in their house between 8 o'clock at night and 6 in the morning, that's their home address, and that can be used. So there are many things that the digital innovation is doing in Africa. And in terms of opportunity, they are legion everywhere, from small startups to increasingly large tech companies in Africa, which are starting to spread internationally. I would say essentially choose your country, choose the area you're interested in, and get out there.
So Ted, now you're working for yourself, started your own advisory. So could you tell us a little bit what it does and why did you start it?
Oh yes, thank you. Yes, so last year I set up Kleos Advisory Limited. Essentially as an advisory, it focuses on African markets, commodities and Fintech. But they're very broad subjects there, and what I try to do is offer strategic help to companies and particularly banks and manufacturers who are looking to invest or do business in Africa, but also technology companies who are trying to push out new innovations. I also speak at conferences, chair conferences, so I have quite a wide remit.
So what we usually do at the end of our video is that we ask our interviewer to give our community a 30-second elevator advice. So what would your advice be?
I think to sum it up, I would say do not fear. The thing on the other side of fear is success. The only thing holding you back is that fear. So when you are ready to act, act and forget the fear. Okay.
Thank you so much for being here, Ted, and I think our community will really appreciate your advice.
My pleasure.